everyone. Well, the last time we were together, we spent the week in the book of Psalms because David is the writer of the Psalms, and we spent some time understanding that book a little bit. But today we're back in the book for Samuel, back in the life of David. Do you ever get from God what you don't expect, or maybe don't want? Have you gone into serving God in some way and then found that your life seems to fall apart? I mean, what's with that? How can it be that you committed yourself to doing something for God and He made things worse for you or let things get worse in your life? Is that fair? Now, the first time I taught this lesson, which was about four and a half years ago, Brent had, on the Sunday that I was preparing for this passage, Brent had given an illustration in the Sunday morning service, and I used it as an illustration then, and I'm going to use it again today. I don't have time for all the details, but it's the story about a man named David Flood from Sweden, who went, along with his wife and his 2-year-old son, to a remote area of the Belgian Congo, as it was known then, as missionaries. They were not allowed into the village. The chief wouldn't let them in, and so they built huts and lived nearby, and there was another family that was also from Scandinavia that was there as well, the Ericsons. They were always sick. They had malaria. They couldn't share the gospel with the people of the village, except for this one little boy who was allowed to come twice a week and sell them chickens and eggs. And the Ericsons eventually left and went back to the main mission station because there was just, the work was so discouraging, but the Floods remained. Then David Flood's wife got pregnant and she had a baby girl. But a few weeks later, she died, and that absolutely broke David. He buried his wife. He took the baby to the Ericsons, telling them that he could not raise her. And then he took his son and went back to Sweden. And he walked away from God. He said that all the tragedy was God's fault, and God had destroyed his life. Now, it's sad to hear that kind of a story, but it's kind of understandable. I wonder if the biblical David was ever tempted to have that same sort of reaction that David Flood had. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 18, and David has been taken into the household of King Saul. Jonathan, the son of Saul, loves David like his own soul. They are like twin brothers. They are committed to each other in a solid, deep, loyal friendship from this day onward. Jonathan is a godly man, a man of faith, and he is perceptive. He seems to get something that no one else really understands. He seems to see what God's plans are for David. Jonathan is the eldest son of Saul. He is the heir, the crown prince. But don't miss what it says in verse 4. He gives to David his robe, tunic, sword, bow, and belt. These are all symbols of his status and position as the heir, as the crown prince. He gives them to David in acknowledgement of God's plan to make David king. There's no rancor or jealousy on the part of Jonathan. We can't say that about Saul. David serves Saul, and David is given rank in the army and serves wherever he has sent. And God gives him success. Everyone is pleased with David. People sing about David, especially after the battle with Goliath. The women credit David with more success in battle than Saul, and Saul gets jealous. Now, jealousy is a pride-based emotion that fuels fear and paranoia. It is an emotion that won't allow us to take any pleasure in the success of another. It denies God the right to bless or gift another in the way that he chooses. Saul is jealous. He becomes fearful. He continues to suffer from this evil spirit that comes over him. So David has to play the harp for him. And one day while David's playing for him, he tries to kill David by picking up his spear and hurling it at David. In fact, he does it twice, but David escapes. Fearful, Saul sends David to battle, hoping that he will die in battle. But David wins campaigns. He has success because the Lord is blessing him. Saul tries another tact. Remember that the daughter of Saul was supposed to be given in marriage to the one who killed Goliath, and that seems not to have happened. We have no idea why. Maybe Saul reneged. Maybe David thought he wasn't worthy to be the son-in-law of the king. We're going to see in a second that he does feel that way. And so Saul offers that if David serves him and fights for him in battle, he will give David Merab, his eldest daughter, to marry. And David says he is not worthy to be the son-in-law of the king. So she's married to somebody else. Then Saul hears that his daughter Michal is in love with David, and he sees another chance. He suggests, to make a long story short, that David can marry her if he brings to Saul the foreskins of 100 Philistines. He hopes David will attempt this and die at the hand of the Philistines. David sees a way to earn the right to marry the daughter of the king. So he gets the foreskins of 200 Philistines, twice the number required. Since the Philistine men did not obviously give these up willingly, it means that David had to fight and kill 200 enemy men, or at least subdue them sufficiently to remove their foreskins. And so Saul marries Michal to David, hoping that she will be a snare for David, hoping that she will be his ally against David. Saul realized the Lord is with David, and his daughter loves David very much. So Saul is even more afraid of David. He remains an enemy of David for the rest of his life. And meanwhile, David continues to go out to battle and to be successful there. Spiritual success and suffering often go hand in hand. Now that seems contradictory to us. How can we be successful while also suffering because we are serving God? David seems to struggle a little bit with this concept. And he says in Psalm 59 verse 4, "I have done no wrong, yet they are ready to attack me." Now I have to be clear here. God gave David tangible success in battle. God made him victorious against the enemy, but spiritual success is usually not tangible, at least not material or physical. It does not consist of a lack of suffering or of physical benefits. In fact, I think God defines success as the ability to persist in faithful obedience regardless of circumstances. And that's what David did. Where are you serving and has led to some suffering? This is the normal experience of Christians. Matthew 10:22 tells us that all believers will be hated for the sake of Jesus. Are you able to persist in faithful obedience in the face of the time of suffering or persecution that you are in? Maybe you're not suffering, but you're finding the service harder than you thought. It's taking more time or costing more than you wanted in freedom or sleep. In what area are you tempted to quit? To stop doing what God called you to do? Will you ask God for the ability to keep on keeping on faithfully and obediently? God will bless you with spiritual success, but he won't necessarily take away the cost or the suffering that comes with serving him. So, chapter 19, things seem to worsen for David, at least on the personal safety front. Saul goes from throwing the occasional spear and hoping David will die in battle to actually commanding his men to find and kill David. And Jonathan warns David. He promises to speak to Saul on David's behalf. And he does. Jonathan reminds Saul that David has done nothing wrong. It is dishonorable, wrong to try to kill David. And Saul agrees, and he promises, as the Lord lives, he will not harm David. And so David returns to serving Saul and playing the harp for him. Did that seem odd to you? That David keeps going back? He keeps serving Saul and fighting for Israel. Of course, as a man who someday will be king, fighting for Israel will be his job. So he is acting for his nation here. And serving Israel is the task, serving Saul is the task God has put in front of him. He does it faithfully and obediently in spite of the wickedness of Saul. David is not doing this for Saul. He's doing it for God. In verse 8, it tells us war breaks out again and David fights. He crushes the enemy. Again, he is playing the harp for Saul. When an evil spirit comes upon him, Saul throws the spear again and tries to pin David to the wall, and David makes his escape that night. But this time, Saul sends men to David's house to lie in wait and try to kill him. Now remember, this is also the house of his daughter. He has fallen very far into wickedness. Michal tells David to flee if he wants to escape with his life. And she helps buy him time by this little ruse with putting an idol in the bed, covering it up and pretending that he is in bed and he is sick. When Saul asks her why she helped David, she blames David, saying he threatened to kill her if she didn't help him get away. Maybe she did this out of fear of her father. Certainly, she has reason to believe he will stop at nothing to kill her husband. David fled to Samuel, and Samuel takes him down to a town where the prophets live. Saul sends men to take David, but the Spirit of the Lord comes over these men, and when they get there, they start prophesying. We don't know what they're prophesying about, just that they're speaking for God. So Saul sends more men, and the same thing happens again, and he sends a third group, and the same thing happens yet again. I wonder if they're all prophesying about David's kingship. Wouldn't that be ironic? But we're not told exactly what they prophesied about. So finally, Saul decides that he's just going to go and do this himself. And so he goes down to the town. He is openly now trying to kill David personally. But when he gets to this place, he too is overtaken by the Spirit of God. And the Spirit is on him to cause him to see he has no power over David. And so the Spirit causes him to prophesy himself and to be naked while doing it. He lays there all night and all day prophesying under the control of God. God is protecting David. David may be in fear of his life in human terms, but he is actually completely secure. God is holding David safe and keeping him regardless of the plans of Saul. Now, this doesn't mean to say that believers are never hurt or killed, because we know that isn't true. It does mean that our lives lie in the hands of God and no one can touch us outside of his timing. God has plans for David to make him king, and nothing Saul does is going to stop God's plans. In the same psalm in which David writes of the men who surrounded his house to take his life, Psalm 59, he writes of God as his security. No matter what happens to him, live or die, he knows he is safe in God's love. But I will sing of your strength. In the morning I will sing of your love, for you are my fortress, my refuge in times of trouble. O my strength, I sing praise to you. You, O God, are my fortress, my loving God. That's verses 16 to 17. Even in suffering, the believer is secure in God. Real security is not physical safety. Real security is spiritual safety. In the hands of God, we are always safe. Safe during this life and safe in the one to come. The safety of our souls is more important than the safety of our bodies. God never takes a rest from his care of us. He never goes on vacation. His care is as constant as his character. We may feel unsafe. We may feel surrounded and pursued. We may be in physical danger. We may even go through death, but we are still secure. David's physical life was still secure at this point. God anointed him king and has work for him to do until it is done. No one can stop him. We often hear the phrase, her life was cut short when someone dies. But as believers, our lives are never cut short. Our lives are in the hands of God. He has a plan, and the time of death of each of us is predetermined. Until that time comes, we are safe. No matter what we are called to do, no matter the inherent risks of serving, we are secure until our time is complete. And then our lives are not cut short. They're concluded right on time. How does the certainty of your security in the hands of God give you confidence to serve him today? How confident are you that God is your refuge and your fortress? In what area do you need to step out in service in spite of the cost or the potential risk? So now, chapter 20 of 1 Samuel, David leaves Naioth in Ramah and goes to Jonathan. And he says that Saul is trying to take his life. Jonathan doesn't believe it. He thinks Saul would have said something to him if he was trying to kill David. He would have told his son. David points out Saul might not want to distress Jonathan, but he insists he is in danger. And Jonathan says he's going to do whatever he can, whatever David suggests. They're going to try to figure out what's actually going on. So they concoct a plan to find out if David is in danger or not. The New Moon Festival is coming up. This is a monthly festival, and David plans to be absent, putting distance between himself and Saul. He tells Jonathan to say, if Saul asks, that David had gone home to his family in Bethlehem for a sacrifice. If Saul is not angry, then David is safe. But if he is angry and upset, then David is not safe, and Saul is looking for an opportunity to kill him. So the first day of the festival, Saul thinks that David might have been ceremonially unclean, and that's why he didn't come. But the second day, when he doesn't show up again, he asks Jonathan where David is. And Jonathan gives the answer that David has gone home to Bethlehem. And Saul is instantly enraged. Not only at David, but at Jonathan. He speaks against not just Jonathan, but Jonathan's mother. In fact, most of the versions don't really give us the fullest translation of these words. He's pretty vile in the things that he says about Jonathan's mother. Saul seems unable to understand why Jonathan is helping David. If David becomes king, Jonathan never will. Saul can't seem to get why it doesn't bother Jonathan. And then in chapter 20, verse 32, Jonathan gives his response. Why should he be put to death? What has he done? Jonathan asked his father. And Jonathan is so angry, he can't eat. He gets up and leaves the table. He's grieved over the shameful behavior of his father. So Jonathan and David have planned a way of communicating about the outcome of this little test that they've done for Saul, of how it's gone. Jonathan is going to go take some arrows and go shoot in a field, and David is going to hide among the boulders in the field. And after Jonathan shoots his arrows, he's going to send a boy out to grab them. And if he yells at the boy to go further, that the arrows are further out, David will know he has to flee, for his life is in danger. And if Jonathan tells the boy, no, you've gone too far, come back this way, for the arrows are closer, then David will know that it is safe for him to come back and that Saul does not mean to kill him. So Jonathan goes shooting, and he shouts at the boy to go out further. And then when the boy found the arrows, he sent him back to the city. Jonathan and David meet there in the field and say goodbye. And there is an interesting interaction. David, the anointed king, bows 3 times before Jonathan, the crown prince. They kiss each other, weeping, and David cries the most. Jonathan reminds David that there is an oath sworn between them, peace between them and their descendants. And this is significant because in the ancient world, when one dynasty took over from another one, the new king would typically kill off all the male descendants of the defeated dynasty so as to remove any threat to the throne that might come from that dynasty. Jonathan is asking David for mercy for his descendants, for peace between the new dynasty and his own family. Jonathan knows that David will be king. And the last line of verse 20 says, then David left and Jonathan went back to the city. Now, I always thought it was too bad, even a lack of faith on the part of Jonathan, that he didn't leave his father and go with David. Why didn't he completely throw in his lot with David? I felt a bit negatively toward Jonathan for not going. But as I was thinking about this, I had a different thought. What if he had gone? What if he'd lived with David in exile for years and then David gets the throne? Jonathan would have been competition, even if he didn't want to be. There would always have been a part of the nation wanting to make this brave warrior crown prince king after his father. Maybe it was God's plan for Jonathan to serve the nation in battle as part of his father's army for years and then to die, so that David had an unimpeded route to the throne. I'm not sure. Maybe Jonathan did the right thing, staying with his father. He certainly was aware that he himself would not be king. His role seems to have been to encourage and support David during this time when David was living in the court of Saul and his life was under threat. God provided others to support his suffering child. Jonathan was a comfort and help to David during this time of struggle in the house of Saul, and so was his wife Michal, who loved him and put him first over her father. David would have been grateful, I'm sure, for those who stood by him. His anguish at leaving Jonathan is symbolic of his deep appreciation for the fellowship with him and his pain over the loss of that. Who has God given you? Sometimes we're so focused on the suffering, we forget that there are people who are carrying us, praying for us, encouraging us, helping us bear up under the struggle. Often the care of God comes to us through the hands of a living person. For whom should you be grateful to God for the help and the support that they have provided you? I certainly have had a great deal of help, especially in the weeks right after Len died, and continue to have help from supported friends, other leaders in my church family, as well as my kids. How is God carrying you through others? And how can you thank him for them? How can you show to them that you appreciate their love and support? The story of David Flood I told at the beginning is not over. Through the series of events, the baby girl he left behind ended up in the U.S. She married and was in Seattle when she saw a magazine article that was written in Swedish, and there was a photo in it. Now, she could not read Swedish. She couldn't read the article, but the picture was of a grave in a remote jungle area, and the name on the grave was clearly legible in the photo, and it was her mother's grave. She got someone who could translate, and she read that this was the grave of a woman who had led a small boy who used to sell her eggs to the Lord in this region of Zaire, which is the modern name of the Belgian Congo. That boy, as a man, talked this village chief into letting him open a school for village kids. And over time, he led many of the village kids to the Lord, and those kids led their families to Jesus. Soon, almost the entire village, including the chief, had become Christians, and there were now thousands of Christians in that region of Zaire. Years later, this woman found her biological father, David Flood. He was old and dying and bitter against God. But over time, at hearing from her about what had happened in Zaire through her mother, he returned to the Lord before he died. More time passed, and this grown daughter was at a conference in Britain, and a man from Zaire was speaking about all the amazing things that God has been doing in that country. She went to talk to him and asked him if he had ever heard of her parents. And the man got really excited. He said, I am the boy that your mother led to Jesus. Your mother is famous amongst our people. She is the most important person in our history. Suffering is what is included in carrying our cross. We share in the suffering of Jesus. Suffering is part of service, part of our life with Jesus, but we're not left in it alone. We're given spiritual success. We are secure physically as long as Jesus is planning on using us, and eternally secure always. And we are provided support to help us through the suffering. And God never wastes it. Never. Just as the suffering of Jesus provided redemption for the entire human race, so too our struggles and suffering has fruit. It is used by God. Our suffering may be the most significant part of the life of another person to bring them to salvation. God uses our suffering for his glory. Matthew 16:24-25. Jesus said, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for me will find it. In Romans 8:18, I consider that our present sufferings are not worthy being compared with the glory that will be revealed in us.